The man known to history as Joseph Stalin was born Yosef Vissarionovich Djugashvili on the 18th of December 1878 in the eastern Georgian town of Gori. This was the 6th of December according to the old-style Julian calendar, which was still in operation in the Russian Empire at the time. Stalin was a pen name which Yosef adopted in his mid-30s. His father was Vissarion Djugashvili, a cobbler who, for a while, had a thriving business, though he failed to change with the times, and his shoes eventually became unfashionable, miring the family in poverty. Yosef's mother was Yekaterina Galadze, a devout Orthodox Christian who had married Vissarion at the age of 16 and went on to give birth to 3 sons, the 2 oldest of which both died in infancy, resulting in Yekaterina placing much of her hopes for the future in her only surviving son. Yosef's parents had a tempestuous relationship and often fought. When Yosef was 10, Yekaterina left Vissarion, as he was, by this time, an abusive alcoholic who would, on his infrequent visits home, beat his wife and son. To escape her husband, Yekaterina sought the help of a family friend named Yakov Ignatashvili, who had been the godfather of her 2 deceased sons. This enabled both mother and son to live in relative security for a time. To get by financially, Yekaterina undertook housework in the local area, including in the house of a priest named Christopore Charkviani, who in 1888 helped acquire a place for Yosef in the Gori church school. He proved himself to be a capable student and quickly rose to the top of his class. Despite this upturn in fortune, Yosef narrowly survived a wave of the smallpox epidemic, one which left his face pockmarked. A much more drastic episode occurred when he was 12 and his left arm was mangled in the wheel of a horse-drawn cart. He was hospitalized for months and was left with limited use of his left arm for the rest of his life. After recovering, though, Yosef shone academically. He was soon recommended by his teacher to join the religious seminary at Tbilisi and was admitted in 1894. However, having arrived to the seminary, it soon became apparent that his path lay elsewhere, after young Yosef declared that he did not believe in God, a crucial problem for any would-be priest. Instead, he began to read forbidden publications such as Nikolai Chernyshevsky's famous novel, What is to be Done, and the notorious Das Kapital by Karl Marx, of whom he subsequently became a great admirer. Yosef soon joined secret socialist workers' meetings within Georgia as resentment and anger was growing here at the oppression of the Russian Tsarist government. By the end of the 19th century, Russia had been ruled by the Tsars for 3.5 centuries, stretching back to Ivan the Terrible, who had proclaimed himself the first Tsar of all Russia in the middle of the 16th century. The Tsars were absolutist rulers, meaning that there was no tradition of a parliament or public representation in Russia. The country had been ruled instead by the Tsars in tandem with the powerful nobles and the Orthodox Church. Russia was a great power, though. Ivan had expanded outwards from the Duchy of Muscovy to conquer lands southwards to the Caspian Sea, and then successors, like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, had conquered large parts of Ukraine and southwards to the Caucasus. The Napoleonic Wars had marked the Russian Empire's transition to great power status, and by the second half of the 19th century, it was seeking to expand into the Balkans to replace the ailing Ottoman Empire as the main power there. while a rivalry had developed in Central Asia with Britain for influence in Persia and Afghanistan. Despite this great power status, domestically Russia was very backwards. The empire's economy was based almost entirely on agriculture, and serfdom had only been abolished in 1861. Tsar Alexander II had attempted wide-ranging reforms prior to his assassination in 1881, but his successor, Alexander III, was a reactionary who doubled down on autocracy. By the time Nicholas II had come to the throne in 1894, major new movements were destabilizing the country. Cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg were industrializing, and this was leading to an influx of radical socialist and communist thought, combined with new indigenous political movements like the anarchists. Many people within these groups and within wider society wanted political representation and a drastic overhaul of Russian society to pull it firmly into the modern age and out of the medieval habits and traditions that it was still mired in. Yet Tsar Nicholas II was the wrong man for this time. He was not a malicious character, but he was weak-willed and of limited abilities, a figure who could not grasp what Russia's problems were and how he might begin to address them. This was the political, social, and economic backdrop against which Josip would begin his political rise in the early 20th century. In 1899, Josip began working as a meteorologist in Tbilisi. His virulent opposition to the Tsarist autocratic government was evolving during this period, and he also began giving speeches at meetings of local workers and clandestine groups that were speaking out against the political system in Russia. These inevitably attracted the attention of the Tsarist secret police known as the Okhrana. He also joined the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, or RSDLP, in 1899, a left-wing socialist movement that had been founded in 1898 and which would eventually become the Russian Communist Party. After he became a member, Josip began infiltrating workers' groups in order to stir up opposition from within them to the government. He developed a reputation for being willing to use violence and illegal methods, engaging in theft and criminality to help fund his own and the party's activities in Georgia. Once the authorities homed in on him in 1901, he left for Batumi on the coast of the Black Sea, where he again organized protests, at one of which many people were shot by the local police. A year later, he was involved in the instigation of an attack on a local prison where several party leaders were being detained, during which over a dozen of the attackers were killed. After he organized yet another protest on the day of his comrades' funerals, he was arrested and sentenced in 1903 to 3 years' exile in Siberia, the cold, desolate region of Russia east of the Ural Mountains. Josip had no intention of respecting the terms of his exile, and he soon managed to escape and headed back west to Tbilisi. There he helped edit an underground newspaper which advocated for the Georgian branch of the RSDLP to split off from the Russian branches of the party and seek Georgian independence. This coincided with a split within the RSDLP, after leading members of the party in exile in Western Europe divided into the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, and the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks were the more hard-line wing who only wanted committed political revolutionaries joining the movement, while the Mensheviks sought a wider base of support. Josip gravitated towards the Bolsheviks. In 1905, during a period of revolutionary activity throughout the Russian Empire, brought about by a massacre of peaceful protesters in St. Petersburg by the Tsarist government on the 22nd of January 1905, Yosep established himself as the leader of a squad of Bolshevik fighters in Georgia. In the period that followed, he and his group effectively became a criminal gang, engaging in robberies, attacks on government buildings, and other illicit activity. Still, it had the desired effect of making him one of the leading Bolsheviks in Georgia, and in November 1905, he was dispatched to represent the region at the party's congress in Stockholm in Sweden. In the years that followed, he continued his operations as a leader of a Bolshevik gang and paramilitary unit, gaining notoriety and a degree of respect amongst the Bolshevik leadership. The most infamous incident during this time was his organization of the Tiflis bank robbery on the 26th of June 1907, a crime in which dozens of people were killed and 250,000 rubles were stolen. In the winter of 1909, he was once again exiled to Siberia, though he yet again escaped and returned to Georgia. In 1912, Yosep was asked by Lenin to join the Bolshevik Central Committee, which he agreed to, but he was then later that year arrested once again and sent into exile. As ever, he soon escaped and went underground in St. Petersburg. There he contributed to the foundation of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, meaning truth. He would be an editor and contributor to it in its first years. It was whilst working on this newspaper that Yosep started to use the pseudonym Stalin, meaning steel. This, along with the anglicization of his first name, resulted in the version of his name that the whole world knows today, Joseph Stalin. Indeed, it was the editorship of Pravda that brought Stalin to the attention of the wider Bolshevik movement. It also cemented his position as one of Lenin's right-hand men, a figure who continued to live in exile in Western Europe and relied on operatives like Stalin to function as his eyes and ears in Russia itself. By the time of the outbreak of the First World War in the late summer of 1914, Stalin was one of the most influential men in the Bolshevik movement. He was, though, yet again in exile, having been sent this time to the Arctic regions of Russia by the government in 1913. When the war broke out in 1914, consideration was given to forcing him to enlist in the Russian army, but he was excused service owing to the disability in his left arm. These were turbulent years in Stalin's personal life too. By this time he had already been through one marriage. Back in 1905, he had been introduced by a revolutionary colleague, Alexander Svanidze, to his sister Yekaterina Svanidze. Stalin married her the following year, and they had a son named Yakov, early in 1907. However, Yekaterina died just a few months later in November 1907, probably from typhus obtained from drinking contaminated water. Stalin was deeply affected by her passing. According to some reports, he had contemplated taking his own life, and stated at her funeral that, quote, "With her died my last warm feelings for humanity." This contrasts sharply with other reports that he had been physically abusive towards her. Yakov was raised by Yekaterina's wider family thereafter. Now in exile in the mid-1910s, Stalin began a relationship with Lydia Pereprigina, a resident of the hamlet of Kureka, that he was banished to. Stalin was 35 years old and she was 14. She became pregnant before long, and although this first pregnancy resulted in a miscarriage, she later gave birth to an illegitimate child of Stalin's named Alexander. By then, Stalin had returned to Western Russia, and although he knew of Alexander's existence, they never met. By the time Alexander was born, Stalin had just met a 17-year-old girl named Nadezhda Alliluyeva. They married in 1919 and would have 2 children, a boy named Vasily, born in 1921, and a daughter, Svetlana, born in 1926. Whilst Stalin was in exile, a great wave of political change began to strike Russia. The army's disastrous performance on the Eastern Front against Germany in late 1916 and early 1917 led to the conservative February Revolution of 1917 in St. Petersburg, which culminated in Nicholas II being forced to abdicate the Russian throne. He was then replaced by a provisional government headed by Alexander Kerensky, but the new regime's grip over the country was still relatively weak, meaning that the influence of the far left in the shape of the Bolsheviks and other groups like the Mensheviks continued to grow unchecked over the coming months. In this environment, Lenin made his way back to Russia from Switzerland, while Stalin quickly slipped away from his exile and returned to St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd during the war. Over the next few months, Lenin, in conjunction with figures like Stalin and Leon Trotsky, a Jewish Russian Bolshevik intellectual, planned a revolution in Petrograd. They launched this on the 25th of October 1917, according to the old-style calendar, though it was the 7th of November elsewhere in Europe. The October Revolution resulted in the overthrow of the conservative government and the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in Petrograd, Moscow, and other cities. The capital of the newly created Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was moved back to the traditional Russian capital, Moscow. From here, figures like Stalin were involved in the first stages of the Russian Civil War and also organizing peace terms with the Germans so that the Bolsheviks could exit the First World War and concentrate on consolidating their position at home in Russia. A ceasefire was agreed with Germany on the 15th of December 1917, and hostilities with the Central Powers then formally ceased with the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on the 3rd of March 1918. At home, there was fierce resistance to the new Bolshevik government. Opponents of Lenin and the new Soviet-style regime came from many different groups, from the Mensheviks to conservatives and regional groups like the Cossacks of Ukraine and the Finns, who hoped to benefit from the war by winning independence from the Russian state. These opponents of the regime collectively became known as the Whites, who fought the Red Army of the Bolsheviks. The conflict would be fought for half a decade, bringing much hardship, including a terrible famine in the early 1920s that killed millions of Russians. During it, Stalin was sent to the city of Tsaritsyn, present-day Volgograd. He organized the defense of this key city on the river Volga in southwestern Russia. His methods were extreme and included the mass destruction of villages in the wider region to deprive the whites of resources. Many within the Bolshevik movement disapproved of his approach. Years later, Stalin would rename the city Stalingrad. In their campaign against the whites, the Bolsheviks had started to use methods which far outweighed the repressive and brutal nature of the Tsarist regime. It is clear that one of the most relentless advocates of the policy of terror was Stalin. Perhaps the most famous example of the increasingly ruthless approach the communists employed came on the 17th of July 1918, when the former Tsar Nicholas II and his wife and children were executed by the Bolsheviks at Yekaterinburg, where they were being held. During the latter stages of the Russian Civil War, Stalin was appointed to numerous commands, in which he proved to be authoritative and ruthless, in dealing with deserters and was ultimately rewarded by the government with the Order of the Red Banner for his services to the communist cause. He was also involved in the Polish-Soviet War, which had started when the newly re-established Republic of Poland had sought to capitalize on the state of upheaval within Russia in order to expand its eastern frontier. By 1922, it was clear that the Civil War would end in Bolshevik victory, though fighting continued intermittently in some places into 1923. The Bolsheviks lost large parts of the Russian Empire, including Poland, the Baltic Sea states, and Finland, though they retained control over Ukraine and the Caucasus. These were formed into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. The Civil War had caused massive disruption and upheaval across Russia. In response to the death, dislocation, and famine, Lenin had made economic concessions in 1921. Known as the New Economic Policy, the program was a temporary drift away from communist principles in allowing private ownership of goods and industry and a free market to operate. This was undertaken in order to stabilize the war-ravaged economy of Russia. However, it was unpopular with many ideological purists, such as Trotsky within the Soviet government, who argued that the state should control all worker activity and output. Stalin supported Lenin in these temporary measures, an action which made him increasingly powerful as the Civil War came to an end in 1922 and 1923. He was hence able to gain election as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in April 1922, a position of considerable power within the new government which placed him in charge of party membership, along with disciplinarian duties. This role also gave Stalin a foothold in virtually every aspect of the governance of Russia. It ensured he was able to gather information on potential enemies, and he then gradually and quietly began to accumulate more and more power. Then, in May 1922, Lenin suffered a severe stroke which left him partially paralyzed and bedridden. In the months that followed, Stalin tried to control access to Lenin and started taking over a range of his responsibilities. Soon after this, Lenin began to complain to his wife about Stalin, fearing his excessive ambition and the ruthlessness with which he pursued power. He consequently dictated a document that is now known as Lenin's Testament. In this, he urged reform within the party's ruling elite and criticized its leaders. Most importantly, he recommended that Stalin should be removed from his position as General Secretary. Lenin wanted his testament to be read out at the 12th Party Congress in April 1923, but Stalin had the document suppressed and did not allow it to be released to subordinate party members. By then, Lenin was almost completely incapacitated after suffering multiple further strokes. He eventually died on the 21st of January 1924, and the major figures within the Soviet regime then began to vie with one another for control of the Communist Party. Stalin, as General Secretary, began to position himself as one of the leading candidates to succeed his former master. Stalin's foremost rival in this power struggle was Leon Trotsky, a major communist thinker who had been responsible for forming the Red Army into a fighting force capable of winning the Civil War. Initially, Trotsky seemed to be the favorite to succeed Lenin as the leader of the government. However, in the course of 1924 and 1925, Stalin outflanked him by forming a triumvirate of more right-leaning Soviet leaders, along with Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev. Together they marginalized Trotsky in the mid-1920s. Stalin then turned on them and used his growing control over the party apparatus to bring in other individuals to the Politburo and the central government who supported him unflinchingly. Trotsky was removed from his position as the People's Commissar of Military and Naval Affairs in January of 1925. Then he was expelled from the Central Committee in October 1927, banished to Kazakhstan, and later from the Soviet Union altogether in 1929. During his exile, Trotsky became the figurehead of international socialist opposition to his old rival, and went on to write numerous books and articles condemning his former comrade. Eventually, Stalin ordered his secret services to assassinate his arch-enemy, which succeeded after Trotsky was attacked with an ice axe by a Soviet agent at his house in Mexico City. After being taken to hospital, he died from his injuries on the 21st of August 1940. With Trotsky out of the way, Stalin consolidated his grip on power. He still faced some opposition, especially from Nikolai Bukharin. Like Trotsky, Bukharin was a prominent Marxist theorist who had reservations about the kinds of policies Stalin began to pursue from 1927 onwards. He managed to win some support from Zinoviev and Kamenev, and also from Lenin's widow Nadezhda Krupskaya. Stalin eventually moved against them by labeling them as a new right opposition on the right of the party. In any event, they were never able to win over the support of a large proportion of the party. Zinoviev was soon expelled from the party, like Trotsky. Bukharin was completely demoted. Nadezhda retained a position within the Soviet education sector into the 1930s, her position as Lenin's widow protecting her to a considerable degree, though she died under somewhat suspicious circumstances in 1939, with some suspecting Stalin's involvement. Thus, by 1927, Stalin was the de facto head of the Soviet Union, and any remaining opposition was demoted or removed entirely from the party in 1928 and 1929. The man who had come to power as Lenin's successor was a complex figure. It would be easy to dismiss him as a tyrannical powermonger who wasn't wedded to any ideology other than his own accumulation of power. This was one facet of him, but there was more to his personality, ideology, and psychology. He was a communist, or at least conceived of himself as such, and was determined to create a socialist and communist state in Russia. This can be viewed as distinct from the communist theories of the 19th century. Marx, Friedrich Engels, and others wrote about theoretical socialist ideas that they imagined could be applied to Britain, Germany, France, or Belgium. In Russia, figures like Stalin ran into the reality of trying to apply their theoretical concepts in a country with a political culture of autocracy and violence stretching back centuries. Stalin's desire to apply what he believed were communist principles was reflected in his written output. He wrote and published many books and papers on communist theory. In them, he demonstrated a considerable knowledge of Marxist theory and a capacity to reflect on the Soviet Union's level of development towards communism. He was not an intellectual in the same vein as Trotsky, and this was possibly one of the reasons why he disliked his rival so much. Yet he was still an intelligent figure, though one seemingly devoid of any ethical restraint or moral compass. In many ways, as leader of the Soviet Union, he was the same as the figure who worked for the party in Georgia in the late 1800s and early 1910s, a would-be communist who mixed revolutionary ambitions with running a criminal gang. We get a good sense of Stalin's intellectual and personal world from assessing his library, something which has been the subject of an extensive recent study. Stalin owned somewhere in the region of 20,000 books. These were not simply volumes that he had someone working in his office accumulate and put on a shelf to make it seem to visitors that he was well read. Many of the books in question contain marginal annotations by Stalin that he made as he read them, and he was known to read several books every week. When he died in 1953, his desk was covered with stacks of books. His tastes were wide-ranging. Beyond the obligatory corpus of Marxist and communist writings, he was an avid reader of the classics of Russian literature by Alexander Pushkin, Leo Tolstoy, and others, while he was a fan of Shakespeare, Victor Hugo, and Daniel Defoe, gifting his adopted son a copy of Robinson Crusoe. His marginal annotations were often basic, writing his agreements with certain points made or, at other times, writing things like rubbish or gibberish when he disagreed with a point being made. Although his copies of Fyodor Dostoevsky's books are lost, we know he was a critic of his view of Russian society. In a revelatory act, Stalin once underlined a quote that was attributed to Genghis Khan in a book in which the Mongol warlord stated that in order to establish peace of mind after a victory, the defeated had to be vanquished utterly. It was exactly what he had done with Trotsky and would do with his other remaining rivals in the 1930s. The foremost question confronting the Soviet Union as Stalin consolidated his position in the mid-1920s was the country's future economic policy. The new economic policy that Lenin had pursued in his last years had only ever been a temporary expedient, one which most of those who oversaw it did not like, and which had capitalist elements. Now, with peace and stability restored, there was room to begin implementing ambitious policies to transform Russia's economy towards a communist one. To this end, in 1928, Stalin began the first five-year plan. The concept of a five-year plan had originated with Trotsky, who first proposed it in 1925. Stalin accepted the validity of the approach and pursued it. The goal of the first five-year plan, which would operate down to 1932, was to rapidly expand the industrial economy of the Soviet Union. At the time of the revolution in 1917, Russia had a number of cities with a considerable industrial capacity, but the USSR was still a resoundingly agricultural and rural society. Heavy industry of any kind hardly existed east of the river Volga. The first five-year plan sought to expand things like steel and coal production at a very quick rate. This would be achieved by introducing efficiencies into the agriculture sector by developing large state-run collective farms that would require less labor to produce larger amounts of food, thus freeing up rural farmers to move to the cities and work in the new factories. This was the basic theory which underpinned the first five-year plan. If it is viewed solely from the perspective of the increase in industrial capacity across the USSR, there is no doubt that the first five-year plan was considerably successful. The number of industrial factory workers doubled from around 3 million to 6 million, while large factories and plants were established to increase production of basic commodities like steel and iron, and manufactured goods like automobiles and tractors, as well as the extraction of raw materials like coal, oil, and copper. The Soviets were not dogmatic in how they approached this. They invited industrial experts from the US and Western Europe into Russia to provide technical expertise. For instance, the Stalingrad tractor plant, in what is now Volgograd, was built by Albert Kahn Associates, the firm that had worked closely with Henry Ford in developing his automobile factories in Detroit. Production and output of everything increased in the late 1920s and early 1930s. There has been much emphasis placed since on Soviet propaganda and the way that it exaggerated the scale of industrial improvement at this time. But while there was a lot of propaganda, there was also a substantial amount of truth underlying the claims being made. Iron production, for instance, doubled by 1932. Another knock-on effect was a steady increase in literacy levels. Stalin's government was anxious that the workers of tomorrow would be able to take courses on things like manufacturing and increase their technical knowledge. They would need to be able to read to do so. Where literacy levels in Russia were little above 20% of the population in 1900, nearly 90% of people were literate in 1940. The average visitor to Moscow, Leningrad or Kiev in the late 1920s and early 1930s would have seen posters encouraging men and women alike to learn to read. This was the positive side of the first 5-year plan and Stalin's early time in charge. There was no shortage of negative elements as well. While industrial productivity had expanded and industrial policy would continue to flourish in the USSR for decades to come, the policy of farm collectivization initially led to immense suffering. Part of the goal here was to break the economic power of the kulaks, a class of wealthy peasants who owned extensive farms and livestock. These were perceived as opponents of the regime and individuals who had profited from the abolition of serfdom in 1861 at the expense of the average agricultural worker. Stalin developed a particular ideological objection to the kulaks, though his designation of who was a kulak was very loose. Consequently, the collectivization strategy involved taking land and herds away from both wealthy and middling farmers and forming these into huge collective farms, where farm machinery such as that being produced at the new Stalingrad tractor factory was introduced. The scale of collectivization was huge. Over 50% of Russian peasants were operating within collective farms by 1931. Often this was achieved through coercion and violence. People were forced into what were little better than labor camps. Many did not know what was happening and believed that these strange bureaucrats from Moscow, with their unusual ideas about a thing called communism, were forcing them back into the serfdom that their grandfathers had been liberated from 70 years earlier. The collectivization strategy was not just difficult for those who had little option but to accept what the state dictated to them. It would also end very badly in the short run. Often the collective farms were being overseen by Soviet officials who had grown up in the cities of the West and who knew little about farming. In some cases, yields fell as the system was introduced. More worryingly, Stalin and his advisors decided that the best way to facilitate the industrial program was to manage how agriculture produce was distributed in order to favor urban communities. This had catastrophic consequences. Between 1930 and 1933, famine struck much of the USSR. The region running from Ukraine eastwards through southwestern Russia and the Caucasus and into Kazakhstan was the epicenter of it. As agricultural workers were pulled away from the new collective farms, and Stalin issued orders for the kulaks to be liquidated as a social and economic class, agricultural output fell dramatically. Even when it became clear what was happening, the policy of prioritizing urban, industrial communities for grain distribution was continued. As people began starving to death in the countryside, many fled into the towns and cities. The famine followed them as the supplies here were consumed. It is estimated that anywhere between 4 and 9 million people died in total. The death toll was especially large in Ukraine, where these events are known as the Holodomor, death by hunger, and Stalin bears considerable guilt for executing policies which killed so many and for failing to respond in a humane way once it became apparent what was happening in Ukraine and southern Russia. It was during the Holodomor in Ukraine and the wider famine that Stalin's personal affairs took a controversial turn. He had remained married to his second wife, Nadezhda, throughout the 1920s and his rise to absolute power. Their family extended beyond their 2 biological children. In 1921, Stalin's son from his first marriage, Yakov, who by then was 14 years old, joined them in Moscow, while they also adopted Artyom Sergeyev, the infant son of Fyodor Sergeyev, a friend of Stalin's and a senior Bolshevik, who died testing the Aerowagon, an experimental Russian high-speed train, in the summer of 1921. Despite the surface image of a happy nuclear family, Stalin and Nadezhda argued frequently, often owing to his possible infidelities and frequent prolonged absences from home. She also suffered from bouts of depression and ill health. All of these issues came to a head at a celebration to commemorate the 15th anniversary of the October Revolution, held in Moscow in early November 1932. At the reception, Stalin and his wife flung insults at each other. She had seemingly learned of the famine that was occurring in Ukraine and southern Russia, and the worsening of it by her husband's policies. Stalin was drunk and openly flirted with another woman. Then, on the morning of the 9th of November, Nadezhda was found dead, having seemingly shot herself in the heart. Stalin was disturbed by this turn of events, and it is generally accepted that she did take her own life. But the circumstances of her death were not made public. It was simply noted that she had died unexpectedly. Stalin's relationship with his children was strained for the rest of his life. He was closest to his daughter Svetlana, though when she developed a teenage crush on a filmmaker named Alexei, Stalin had him sent into exile in Siberia. Svetlana would famously defect to the United States in 1967 and only died in Wisconsin in 2011. 1932 could be viewed as a turning point in Stalin's life and rule over the Soviet Union in more ways than one. As ruthless as his takeover of power had been in the 1920s, it had few casualties. Conversely, what Stalin engaged in during the mid to late 1930s was unprecedented in how repressive and totalitarian it was. From its earliest days, the Soviet system had included a secret police and labor camps. These were features of Russia's political culture and extended back to the 16th century when Ivan the Terrible had created one of history's first secret police forces. The Cheka and Secret Police was set up in December 1917, and the main Directorate of Correctional Labor Camps was founded not long after. The latter became known as the Gulag, an abbreviation of its name. Stalin expanded his camp system far and wide. Anyone who was in any way deemed a threat to the regime or Soviet principles was liable to find themselves sent to labor camps in Siberia and the frozen Arctic, the very places Stalin had been sent so regularly in his younger years. The 1930s saw the system reach a level of severity not previously seen. Overall, between 1930 and the end of Stalin's rule in 1953, over 4 million people were sent to the Gulag camps. Furthermore, the conditions were much worse than had been the case under the Tsarist system of Siberian exile. Stalin survived his spells in the frozen east and north. Over 1.5 million of the people sent to the Gulag camps by Stalin's government between 1930 and 1953 did not. Many of those who ended up in the Gulag camps were victims of the Great Purge, which Stalin orchestrated between 1936 and 1938, the peak of which came in 1937. This was undertaken by Stalin in an effort to cement his control over the Soviet Union, though it is hard to see how he perceived that there was any real threat to his position by the mid-1930s beyond general discontent with elements of Soviet economic policy. The Great Purge began with efforts to root out any possible opponents from within the senior members of the communist political establishment. It then expanded outwards to local officials and provincial party members. Soon the Red Army was being systematically scoured for imaginary enemies. The final stages of the Great Purge were still underway when the Second World War began, with Nikolai Yezhov, for instance, a figure who had overseen many of the purges on Stalin's behalf, being executed in February 1940 as his master turned on him too, attempting to blame his underlings for excesses. In total, over a period of 2.25 years between the summer of 1936 and late 1938, upwards of 750,000 people were executed, and hundreds of thousands more were sent to the camps or otherwise punished. An unexpected consequence of this was that the Red Army was deprived of some of its best generals and divisional commanders, just as the USSR was about to head into the largest war in human history. The most notorious element of Stalin's Great Purge was the Moscow show trials. These were a series of staged trials held in Moscow between 1936 and 1938, in which the Great Purge was justified by dragging Stalin's old enemies from the Trotskyite faction and right opposition in the 1920s out of retirement and obscurity, and placing them on trial in public in the capital. Amongst those that Stalin ordered to be placed on trial in this manner were Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, the two figures who had aided his rise to power back in the mid-1920s and then had been violently ostracized by him from the Politburo, as well as Nikolai Bukharin. Many of these men made elaborate confessions when questioned on the stand. The manner in which they implicated themselves shocked international observers and inspired Arthur Koestler to write Darkness at Noon, one of the great novels of the 20th century. Yet the motivations of those who confessed to all manner of invented crimes are hardly too mysterious. They were told by Stalin that if they played along with the trials in public, he would spare their lives. As soon as the trials were over, they were all executed in the basement of the prison they were being detained in. As the Great Purge was underway, the second 5-year plan was coming to a conclusion. This had been initiated straight after the first 5-year plan by Stalin, and ran to 1937. It was followed immediately afterwards by the third 5-year plan, which was interrupted in 1941 by the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Both of these continued to see steady improvements in industrial productivity, and by the end of the 1930s, the USSR was beginning to catch up with Germany in many elements of heavy industry. Moreover, the agrarian catastrophes of the first 5-year plan were not repeated. Stalin, who had once attended a religious seminary, ordered a major attack on the Orthodox Church through the Second Plan and the mass confiscation of church land. Incentives were introduced to encourage factory workers to increase their productivity. All of this met with considerable success. The Russian economy would not have been capable of the level of industrial productivity that allowed it to defeat the Nazis in the Second World War, had it been so invaded in Tsarist times. Moreover, the groundwork was laid in the 3 decades between the mid-1920s and Stalin's death in 1953 for the excellent growth rates which the Soviet economy sustained through the 1950s and 1960s. It was only in the mid-1970s when systemic issues emerged within the economic planning of the Soviet system that the economy of the USSR began to stagnate. So what did all this amount to? The peculiar mix of 5-year plans that were much more effective than many observers would like to admit, the brutal manner in which end goals justified draconian means, the ruthless centralization of power in the hands of one person, and the near-total crackdown on any political or social opposition. Historians in the second half of the 20th century were uncomfortable with describing this simply as communism. In light of this, the term Stalinism was developed as early as the 1930s, though Stalin himself disliked the word, and it only entered wide usage after his death. Essentially, Stalinism combined elements of communism and Leninism into a new system, which was suffused with a ruthless application of policy and a dictatorial centralization of power. Within Stalinism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which earlier communist theorists had written about, became the dictatorship of Stalin and Stalin alone. Things like famine, mass arrests, show trials, ethnic cleansing, and mass murder were all presented as necessary evils on the road to communism, while a pervasive cult of leadership suffused Soviet society. Stalinism was communism crossed with a leadership cult that had no moral barometer. Stalinism would soon be pitched against the other political ideology that emerged in Europe in the interwar period. Fascism had first emerged in Italy in 1922, though it is with Germany that it will forever be associated. The Nazis had claimed power there in 1933, and had immediately set about trying to overturn the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had dismantled the German Empire in 1919 and severely curtailed Germany's strength as a European nation. Fascism was a complicated ideology. A large number of the fascist leaders in Italy, Germany, and elsewhere had previously been involved in communist movements in their countries before becoming fascists, and indeed the Nazis conceived of themselves as National Socialists. This early entanglement with communism had led to a bitter rivalry, and the Nazis perceived the Bolsheviks of Russia as being their main ideological enemy, a legacy of the running street battles that had been fought between German communists and right-wing groups in Berlin, Munich, and other cities back during the German Revolution of 1919. As the Nazis expanded to aggressively annex Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939, it appeared inevitable that someday the Germans and the Soviets would end up at war. The world was consequently shocked to learn that on the 23rd of August 1939, the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who Stalin had only appointed 3 months earlier, had negotiated a major diplomatic agreement with his German counterpart, Joachim von Ribbentrop. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact laid out a non-aggression agreement between the two nations and paved the way for the Nazis to invade Poland 9 days later. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact could just as easily have been called the Hitler-Stalin Pact. To the rest of the world, it was simply a non-aggression agreement, but secret clauses were included and kept private. These allowed for Hitler to conquer the bulk of Poland, while Stalin was to be allowed to occupy the eastern sections of Poland, the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and much of Lithuania, as well as Finland. In essence, this was an agreement between the Nazi and Soviet dictators, whereby they would conquer most of the lands in Eastern Europe, which the German Empire and the Russian Empire had lost at the end of the First World War, and in the course of the Russian Civil War. The Nazis invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, triggering the Second World War, as Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later in response. Just over 2 weeks later, on the 17th of September, Stalin ordered his forces into eastern Poland to make good on his claims thereto. It wasn't until the following year, in the summer of 1940, that Stalin implemented measures to occupy the Baltic states, while Soviet troops also occupied the provinces of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in the northern parts of Romania in late June and early July 1940. Stalin had been slow in implementing the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact when it came to the Baltic states. The delay was partly because the Nazi invasion of the Low Countries and France in May 1940 had provided a smokescreen for Stalin to do so. More importantly, he had been distracted by events elsewhere. After the conquest of eastern Poland in the autumn of 1939, the Soviet Red Army had turned its attentions to Finland. Stalin ordered his troops over the border into the country on the 30th of November 1939. It had been expected that what became known as the Winter War would be a short, sharp affair, one in which the might of the Red Army would quickly conquer Finland, a country of just 3.7 million people. The Soviet dictator began to receive frustrating reports within days. The Finns were proving unusually resilient and were engaged in a guerrilla war that included homemade incendiary devices which they ironically named Molotov cocktails, in recognition that their country was being invaded because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Winter War would drag on until mid-March, when peace terms were agreed, whereby Finland ceded less than 10% of its territory to the USSR. The conflict highlighted the weaknesses of the Red Army, many of which were self-inflicted. The Great Purge of the 1930s had seen many of Russia's foremost generals ousted or killed by Stalin. He only had himself to blame now that his armed forces were failing to defeat small nations like Finland on the battlefield. The deficiencies in the leadership and fighting capabilities of the Red Army would become much more serious in the summer of 1941. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had established a treaty of non-aggression between Germany and the USSR for 10 years. Having conquered Western Europe in less than 7 weeks in May and June 1940, the Nazis had initiated the Battle of Britain. But Hitler soon grew weary of trying to bludgeon the British into submission and turned his attention eastwards. Here was the real ideological foe as far as the Nazi dictator was concerned. Only through war with the Soviet Union would the Lebensraum, or living space, which was so central to Nazi political and racial ideology, be made available. Accordingly, he began preparing Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, whereby 3 million men would invade Stalin's nation on the 22nd of June 1941. A great criticism which was levelled against Stalin, in his own time and ever since, concerned the lacklustre manner in which he prepared for the Nazi invasion. It was very peculiar. He was convinced that the Germans were not going to do so for some time, and ignored intelligence reports which demonstrated that millions of German military personnel were clearly being massed in Poland for the invasion of the Soviet Union. It is possible there was an element of wishful thinking here. The debacle of the Winter War had dented Stalin's confidence in the Red Army, and on the 13th of April 1941 he had agreed to a non-aggression pact with the Empire of Japan, an ally of Germany's, in the hope that this would delay any potential Nazi offensive. It didn't, and on the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa commenced. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union went as badly as it possibly could have for Stalin in the first 3.5 months. Eastern Poland and Belarus were quickly overrun, and the German Army Group South moved quickly into Ukraine. Large-scale encirclements of detachments of the Red Army led to the capture of hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war in July, August and September, while thousands of Russian tanks and airplanes were captured. Kyiv fell in late September. By October the race was on to capture Moscow and Leningrad before the worst of the Russian winter set in. Stalin's response to all of this was not immediately good. It has been argued that he suffered some sort of temporary psychological collapse following the German invasion, one which meant that it was Molotov rather than Stalin who addressed the Russian people via radio shortly after the invasion to alert them to what was happening. One version of events also has it that in the first weeks of the campaign, Stalin was in talks with the Bulgarian ambassador in Moscow, Ivan Stamenov, to see if the Bulgarians would act as intermediaries to broker peace terms. It is believed Stalin pondered the possibility of relinquishing eastern Poland and much of Ukraine and Belarus to the Nazis in return for peace. The veracity of this has never been 100% established, as much of the evidence of such talks would have been comprehensively destroyed in the years that followed. What is clear is that while Stalin's initial reaction to the invasion by the Nazis was not ideal, he quickly kicked into action. Within days of the invasion, he issued an order that the Red Army was to engage in scorched earth tactics, whereby crops were to be burned, and everything that could be of value to the enemy was to be either destroyed or removed before the Nazis could claim it. In this, he was mimicking the actions of the Russians during the Napoleonic invasion of Russia in 1812. On the 30th of June 1941, he established the State Defense Committee to manage the war effort centrally, with himself as Supreme Commander. Other measures involved mobilizing vast parts of the Soviet population to begin working in munitions and armaments factories, while the women of Moscow were co-opted into digging defensive earthworks around the city in the autumn of 1941. As the months went by, Stalin grew into the position of wartime leader and offered effective leadership of the Soviet Union during what became known to Russians as the Great Patriotic War. His leadership was not pleasant by any means. Atrocities were committed against collaborators, recruits to the Red Army were treated as cannon fodder, and the NKVD and other security branches conducted a relentless propaganda war against their own people. But ultimately, Moscow and Leningrad held out against the Nazi assault, and more than anywhere, the Second World War was won by the Soviets on the Eastern Front. A sign of how ruthless Stalin could be was the case of his own son from his first marriage. Yakov was captured on the front lines in mid-July 1941. When Stalin learned of this, he expressed dismay that he had not killed himself before being captured. He even had Yakov's wife temporarily arrested. Stalin would eventually refuse to negotiate terms for the return of his son to Russia, and he died at Sachsenhausen concentration camp in April 1943. By then, the war had turned. The focus of it in the second half of 1942 had switched to the city that bore Stalin's own name. Stalingrad, on the Volga River, was considered the key to the oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler ordered a large assault on the city in the late summer of 1942, the belief now being that depriving the Soviets of their oil sources might be the only way to achieve victory in the war after the United States had joined the conflict in December 1941. Stalin issued Order Number 227 on the 28th of July 1942 in response. In this, he issued the famous instruction, "Not a step back." Henceforth, the Red Army was to hold firm and not surrender Stalingrad to the enemy. One of the bloodiest military clashes in history followed, during which the Germans nearly secured control over the city in September 1942. But the Red Army fought back in October and in November launched Operation Uranus. Through this, the German Sixth Army was encircled. With their supplies cut off and no possibility of major reinforcement, the Sixth Army was defeated at the end of January 1943. With this, Soviet victory on the Eastern Front became something of an inevitability, though it would take 2.5 more years of bitter fighting before the Germans were pushed all the way back to Berlin. During that 2.5-year period, Stalin was attending a growing number of Allied conferences and war summits. The most important were those held at Tehran in Iran in late November 1943, at Yalta in the Crimea in February 1945, and at Potsdam in Germany in the summer of 1945, after the Germans were defeated. During these, the post-war settlement of Europe was debated and negotiated over between Stalin, Churchill, and President Roosevelt of the United States. Stalin had a surprisingly good working relationship with Roosevelt. He and Churchill clashed frequently. A major source of tension was the post-war status of Poland, Greece, and several other countries. Stalin pushed for these countries, which the Red Army was liberating, to be spheres of Soviet influence after the war. Churchill would eventually win out when it came to Greece, though Poland would fall into the Soviet sphere by dint of being wholly occupied by the Red Army in the course of the second half of 1944. Beyond these discussions, Stalin pushed consistently for the opening of new fronts by the Western Allies in Southern and Western Europe to take some pressure off the Soviets on the Eastern Front. It was also agreed that the USSR would not declare war yet on the Empire of Japan, but would do so within 3 months of the defeat of Nazi Germany. By the time Stalin met with Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta in February 1945, the Western Allies were entering the Rhineland in Western Germany while the soldiers of the Red Army were moving towards Berlin. They encircled the city, and in April the battle for the capital of the Third Reich commenced. On the 30th of April, Hitler took his own life, and his nominated successor, Joseph Goebbels, imitated him the following day. Karl Dönitz, the head of the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, then took over as head of a government operating from Flensburg on the German-Danish border. He surrendered to the Western Allies, and the Act of Surrender was signed at Reims in France on the 7th of May. Stalin immediately objected to this, stating that it was unacceptable that the instrument of surrender would be signed before US, British and French officials in France when the Russian people had done the heavy lifting in the war. He was entirely justified in this view. An estimated 9 million Soviet soldiers lost their lives in the war, with a further 15 to 20 million Soviet civilians on top of that, whereas the combined death toll of the British, French and Americans was around 1.5 million. In light of his objections, a second instrument of surrender was signed by Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the German Wehrmacht, in front of Soviet commanders in Berlin on the 8th of May. It was signed at 2300 hours in the German capital, making it after midnight on the 9th of May in Moscow. For this reason, Victory Day is celebrated in the former countries of the Soviet Union each year on the 9th of May. Stalin oversaw the 1945 Moscow Victory Day Parade on Red Square, the largest military parade ever held there, on the 24th of June 1945. It involved over 40,000 Red Army soldiers. The argument over the signing of the instrument of surrender was just the first of a series of escalating confrontations between Stalin and the governments of the Western Allies once the war was over. Stalin honored his word and declared war on the Empire of Japan in early August 1945, though he was motivated as much by a desire to claim parts of Manchuria and the Korean peninsula as to aid the Americans. Meanwhile, in Europe, it quickly became evident that Poland was going to be established with a pro-Soviet communist government, and that it, like numerous other countries in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, was about to become a satellite of Stalin's Soviet Empire. Though Josip Broz Tito, the partisan leader of the Yugoslav communists who became ruler of the country after the war, would soon steer his own line independent of Moscow. The US managed to win over Greece and Turkey through extensive economic aid. The main points of contention thus became Germany and Austria. In the end, after much wrangling, Austria was allowed to steer its own path in line with the Moscow Treaty of 1943, and in 1955 became independent of both the US and Soviet camps in the Cold War through the Austrian State Treaty. Even today, it remains an outlier in Central Europe in not being a member of NATO. Germany became more contentious, and in the course of 1948, Stalin ordered that rail supplies to West Berlin be prevented from passing through the Soviet spheres of occupation, ultimately leading to the Berlin Airlift and the division of the country into West Germany and Communist East Germany in 1949. While Europe was dividing fairly evenly along pro-US and pro-Soviet camps in the aftermath of the war, the situation was much more positive for Stalin and the communist cause in the Far East. Stalin had provided extensive aid to the communists in the Chinese Civil War, going all the way back to the mid-1920s, when he had first come to power, and their struggle with the Kuomintang. the Chinese nationalists, was just beginning, as he funneled extra arms and aid to the communists who had emerged from the end of the Second World War under the leadership of Mao Zedong as much the stronger of the two factions in the Civil War. The US was becoming equally reluctant to continue providing aid to the nationalists, who President Truman in Washington correctly viewed as appalling kleptocrats. The communists would emerge victorious from the Civil War in 1949. On the 6th of December that year, Mao headed for Moscow by train. 10 days later, he and Stalin sat down in the Kremlin to discuss future relations between the world's most important communist states. There were disagreements between the pair and their diplomats over the next few weeks, but on the 14th of February 1950, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance was signed. It laid out the basis for cooperation between the USSR and the People's Republic of China, economically and militarily. At this stage, Mao was very much the junior partner, and Stalin had succeeded in cutting China off from the Western powers. He scored a further victory months later when the Korean War erupted, a clash over a minor geopolitical region, but one which swallowed up US resources and attentions for years to come. Stalin had other reasons to feel buoyant as the 1940s ended and the 1950s began. In 1942, like many of the other major powers involved in the Second World War, Stalin had ordered the development of a Soviet nuclear weapons program. It plodded along, making little progress in various research facilities near Moscow down to 1945. What changed matters was when the US dropped its 2 nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. As soon as this happened, Stalin informed his security forces that the development of a nuclear weapon was now a priority. Until such time as the USSR had a comparable weapon, it was vulnerable. He appointed Lavrenti Beria, the head of the Soviet security services during the war, to head up the reinvigorated program. Over the next 3 years, Beria oversaw the development of an implosion-type nuclear weapon similar to the bomb that the Americans had dropped on Nagasaki. They were aided by the fact that Stalin's spy ring in the US, headed by Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, had acquired intelligence on the Manhattan Project there. The Soviets tested their first nuclear weapon, RDS-1 or First Lightning, at a site in Kazakhstan on the 29th of August 1949. Stalin was said to have been immensely pleased when he received news of the successful test. An even playing field had, at least temporarily, been achieved in the Cold War, though he would live long enough to see the Americans gain the competitive edge with the detonation of the first hydrogen bomb in 1952. As successful as the late 1940s and early 1950s were for Stalin in terms of the accelerating Cold War, he was never satisfied with developments and remained a paranoid figure, resorting to terror tactics where he felt appropriate. Towards the end of the war in 1944, he had engaged in the forced transplantation of hundreds of thousands of Chechens from the northern Caucasus to Siberia and other parts of Russia, falsely claiming that they had collaborated extensively with the Germans. This act of ethnic cleansing was followed by another major Soviet famine in 1946 and 1947, one which killed at least 1 million people. In this case, the cause of the famine was poor weather and the damage inflicted on the Soviet economy by the Germans, but Stalin compounded the problem through a poorly conceived rationing system and the appointment of Georgy Malenkov, a figure with little or no knowledge of agricultural affairs, to head up the relief program. In the early 1950s, Stalin's atrocities included a purging of Georgia through the Mingrelian affair, where he believed Beria's influence had become too great. He was also largely responsible for a nationwide purge of Jewish doctors and other professionals from their positions after he became convinced that his own Jewish physicians were trying to kill him and other leading Soviet officials. That Stalin's paranoia and wrath had turned towards Russia's doctors is indicative of his growing health problems. He was suffering from a range of issues, ones which led him to employ a team of doctors and also to spend several months of every year at his dacha in Abkhazia in the Caucasus. He was also increasingly reclusive. Once the war celebrations and other events commemorating the conflict had been concluded in 1945, he only gave a handful of public speeches for the remainder of his life. He also decided to get rid of the Politburo and replace it with a new presidium in 1952. Given his behavior, those closest to him must have been glad when the old leader was found face down on the floor on the 1st of March 1953. He had suffered a major cerebral hemorrhage. He died 4 days later on the 5th of March in Moscow at 74 years of age, after what by all accounts was a painful death. His state funeral was held 3 days later, and he was interred in Lenin's mausoleum alongside his predecessor, who, before his own end, had tried to warn the Bolshevik leadership about his successor's flaws. Once a consensus had developed in the years that followed about how catastrophic elements of Stalin's reign had been, a decision was taken to remove his remains from the mausoleum in 1961, and they were buried in the Kremlin Wall necropolis. Stalin's death ushered in a period of uncertainty in the Soviet Union. A dedicated tyrant until the very end, he had made no clear plans for how the succession should occur, and his dictatorial approach was such that there was no obvious successor. The foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, had seemed like a natural heir for much of the 1940s, but he had fallen out of favour at the end of the 1940s. Thus, power devolved to a committee of members of the Presidium, including Beria, Malenkov, and Lazar Kaganovich. Eventually, after months of wrangling, Nikita Khrushchev, a figure who had governed Ukraine for many years, emerged as the new de facto leader of the Soviet Union. He began the gradual process of de-Stalinization. In the mid-1950s, he ordered investigations into the purges of the 1930s and the excessive behavior of Stalin as ruler. Then, on the 25th of February 1956, he gave a closed speech to the 20th Party Congress, in which he denounced Stalin's excesses and the bloodshed of his time as head of the USSR. A year later, he expelled Molotov, Malenkov, and Kaganovich from the central leadership and banished them to remote parts of the Soviet Union, excising the unreformed Stalinists from the party. A more public program of de-Stalinization followed in the years thereafter, with Stalingrad being renamed as Volgograd in 1961. As the decades have gone by, and particularly so since the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, the full extent of Stalin's crimes has been made public. The British-American historian Robert Conquest once stated that no one shaped the course of the 20th century and the lives of more people within it than did Joseph Stalin. there is a lot of truth to this. Stalin ruled the Soviet Union for 3 decades, in which the country emerged from the chaos of the Russian Civil War to become one of the 2 global superpowers. His legacy was the Cold War that outlasted him for nearly 40 years. It would not have been possible had it not been for the enormous industrial and economic gains which occurred in Soviet society through Stalin's 5-year plans, though they came at a terrible price for the victims of the Holodomor and the state terror which Stalin employed to acquire complete control over Russian society. It was also Stalin, more so than any figure other than Winston Churchill, who led the Allied victory over Nazi Germany. If the Soviets had not held firm in the autumn and winter of 1941, under Stalin's leadership, the history of the 20th century could have been very different. Yet these substantial facts aside, there is also no denying that Stalin was an appalling dictator, a man so steeped in bloodshed that none of his achievements were not coloured by his tyrannical behaviour. In total, when the Great Purge, the show trials, the ethnic cleansing, the Holodomor of the early 1930s, and the general attrition that characterized Soviet life under his rule are all taken into account, Stalin was directly responsible for the deaths of upwards of 15 million people, some unintentionally and many intentionally. This makes him one of the foremost mass murderers in history, eclipsed only in the modern world by his enemy and his ally, Adolf Hitler and Mao Zedong. In many ways, Stalin could be said to be the most successful dictator in history, as every enemy who rose against him was defeated or held in check, and it could be said that the only enemy that finally vanquished him was death itself. What do you think of Joseph Stalin? Was he genuinely a communist who believed that the brutal policies he oversaw were the only means of securing the future of the Soviet Union and its path towards communism? Or should he be described primarily as a power-hungry dictator? And was he the crucial figure in the Allied victory over the Nazis during the Second World War? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for watching People Profiles Documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.